We should be very worried. I mean, Afghanistan is bang in the center of Central Asia. It will be a destabilizing influence on all its neighbors. And an extreme Islamist government has just taken power by force. I think that this is a very, very sad symbol of the beginning of Biden's presidency. When he says America is back, he seems to have a vision of a very, very isolationist America. I fear he's taken the wrong lesson from Donald Trump. I mean, effectively, this is a Trump continuity policy. I'm hearing now from Afghans who are seeing Afghan members of parliament now being arrested and rounded up. People have been executed already. There's looting taking place. This progress was being protected by a very, very light international presence. Only 2,500 soldiers, very few casualties from international forces in the last 5 years, and could have been sustained almost indefinitely. We need to think about humanitarian development support for Afghans who remain trapped in Afghanistan, and that means being very generous. I'm talking about hundreds of millions of pounds of investment from the UK alone in trying to make sure we can deal with people whose health systems are collapsing, education systems are collapsing, and in certain cases are now struggling to afford food.
The speed with which Afghanistan has fallen to the Taliban has stunned many observers, not least the US government. There are few Western commentators who know the country better than Rory Stewart, the former MP, author, and diplomat, who walked across Afghanistan in 2002 and who founded a charity there, the Turquoise Mountain Foundation. To discuss what the Taliban's return to power means for Afghanistan, the world, and the United States, I'm pleased to say we're joined by Rory. As recently as July, Joe Biden said that it was highly unlikely that the Taliban would overrun Afghanistan. Why do you think he got it so badly wrong, and why have events moved with such dramatic speed?
George, I think firstly, everybody got this wrong. I mean, Biden has been driven by a very strong view, really, that this is some new Vietnam. And I think that influenced his early career. I also think there's some psychological issues where he's distancing himself from President Obama and refighting battles that he fought in 2009 when he was trying to oppose the Afghan surge. And that, of course, has meant that Biden has been more inclined to accept any intelligence which supports his view. So, of course, if you're trying to withdraw, trying to get out, you're very liable to believe people who will say it'll be fine, the Afghan army will be fine, the Taliban won't be able to overrun the country. Biden's also, of course, said that there wouldn't be any evacuation of the US embassy. This wouldn't be a repeat of Saigon. But it's part of a broader problem, which is that there has been incredible naivety in everybody's approach to Afghanistan over nearly 20 years.
What's your response to those who say that given the Afghan government's seemingly collapsed like a house of cards, despite 20 years of Western engagement and $2 trillion spent, that this proves the whole project was misguided from the start?
Well, my response to that is that a lot of progress was made over 20 years. I mean, when I first saw Kabul, it was, this is the end of the Taliban period, it was a deeply, deeply depressing place. Nearly 4 million Afghans had become refugees. The Taliban government, as people know or should remember, was an extremely brutal, unpleasant government. And it left no opportunities for people, no opportunities for women to go to school. Healthcare was terrible. 1 in 8 children were dying before the age of 5. And over the last 20 years, Afghanistan has developed enormously. Many young people in Kabul now are living lives similar to the sort of lives lived by people in middle-class people in India. And this progress was being protected by a very, very light international presence. That only 2,500 soldiers, very few casualties from international forces in the last 5 years, and could have been sustained almost indefinitely. So I think it's extremely misleading to suggest that there was something necessary or inevitable about this fall. This was a collapse that we caused by a very reckless and sudden withdrawal of all our air support, with little consultation with Afghans or any partners. And that's led to this disaster. But it's nothing really to do with with deep structural elements in Afghan society, or indeed the nature of the intervention. It's quite a short-term, reckless and unnecessary mistake.
Some say that Joe Biden had no choice but to proceed after Donald Trump's so-called peace deal with the Taliban. You obviously disagree with that. What were the other options available to Biden?
The obvious option was to continue to provide support for the Afghan military. I mean, it's true that an Afghan army had been built, but it was an Afghan army that was deeply dependent on air support to prevent guerrilla groups seizing towns. And that air support was provided by the US and its allies. By withdrawing his troops, he didn't just take out US planes. The planes that were provided, for example, to Afghans were maintained by US civilians who were also removed, so it was impossible to even operate these planes. And a few months ago, the US government at one point stopped providing ordnance, stopped providing bombs to those planes. So we basically crippled the Afghan air capacity. But I think more fundamentally was the morale point. US forces left Bagram Air Base in the middle of the night without even informing Afghans they were doing it. So the Afghan commander woke up in the morning to find there was no one there. And it was that sense of betrayal, bewilderment, that really destroyed the morale of the Afghan National Army and made them think that there was almost no point in trying to fight the Taliban, and pushed civilians into this impossible choice where basically they've had to choose between being taken over by the Taliban or trying to fight an almost suicidal resistance. And that's why the Taliban, with very few troops, have taken the country quite quickly.
Do you think had Biden ripped up the Trump deal, that would have required greater and deeper US engagement in the country in the face of retaliation by the Taliban?
No, I don't think that anything in the negotiations or that Trump did would have meant that the US would have needed to keep more troops on the ground. Essentially, it was impossible for the Taliban to capture a town so long as there were US planes in air bases, because it was impossible for them, in brutally, to roll artillery or tanks up the main streets. They were forced to remain a rural insurgency, mostly in southern Afghanistan. They had no conventional military option. And that would have remained the case almost indefinitely.
Of course, it's not just the US government that's been caught unawares, it's the British government too. What do you think the UK should be doing now?
I'm hearing now from Afghans who are seeing Afghan members of parliament now being arrested and rounded up. People have been executed already. There's looting taking place. And as the Taliban consolidate their power, they will want to do a lot more, which will frequently be very brutal, to shore up that power. So that's the first problem. How do you deal with people trying to get out of the country? And that is a humanitarian air corridor, and that is Britain and other countries really thinking about how many refugees they can take and how they can accommodate them and look after them. And I would encourage Britain and the US and Europe and all the allies involved to be generous, because this is something we broke. All these nations actually were very generous with Vietnamese boat people from South Vietnam after the Vietnam War. And we should aim to be doing similar things for Afghans. And we should be very, very pleased to have the kind of Afghans that are leaving the Taliban. These will be highly educated people with enormous skills who will be bringing an enormous amount to our country, and we owe them a huge debt of gratitude. I think the second thing is that we need to think about humanitarian development support for Afghans who remain trapped in Afghanistan, and that means being very generous. I'm talking about hundreds of millions of pounds of investment from the UK alone in trying to make sure we can deal with people whose health systems are collapsing, education systems are collapsing, and in certain cases are now struggling to afford food.
On refugees, how troubled were you by reports that the Home Office was reluctant to take too many Afghan refugees for fear of sending a message to others?
Well, I think it is sad. We do operate in a difficult political environment when it comes to refugees. From Britain to indeed famously Hungary, the question of refugees has become one of the great political touchstones. And a lot of populist movements across the world are driven by anxieties about refugees. So for somebody like me who is trying to argue very strongly that we have a moral obligation towards Afghan refugees, we have to do so in a way that is patient and realistic, that works with these politicians that's in place. I can see the German government potentially being generous, as they have been in the past. I would hope that the British government will step up. I think Scandinavian countries are being generous. Canada has been particularly generous. The US is now beginning to provide lines for potentially hundreds of thousands of Afghans. And ideally, we'd get an international coalition together where different countries commit to different quotas. But we have to do it in a way that reassures politicians and the public that we're doing it in a reasonable way. Otherwise, we'll simply get a flat rejection. And I'm learning, I suppose, as somebody who was a politician for 9 years, to balance my passionate belief that we have a moral obligation towards Afghans with working out how to make this happen practically.
As things stand, the UK was due to cut, or was cutting direct foreign aid to Afghanistan by 78%. Do the events that are unfolding in Afghanistan show why the government's planned cut to foreign aid is incompatible with this aspiration to be a global Britain?
Absolutely, George. I mean, the foreign aid was one of the few things where Britain was really able to assert itself internationally, have an influence in Afghanistan, have an influence in a lot of Africa, play a part in the United Nations, reinforce the operations of our military and our diplomats. It gave Britain real credibility and influence. By cutting by 3/4 our assistance in a lot of the most fragile conflict zones in the world, Britain has effectively stepped out of that role. Now, that may be something that the government wants to do for whatever reasons, but we shouldn't lie to ourselves about what that means. That means a Britain becoming much more insular, much more isolationist, and cutting itself off from an international role. What we can't do is pretend that we are being some great global Britain playing a large role on the international stage if we cut all the resources that we need to do that, all the money we need to do that, the people we need to do that. And if, when faced with a situation like Afghanistan over the last few weeks, we don't actually step into the breach and play an influential role in steering the US towards making a more thoughtful and responsible decision, doing so with our international partners, of course. I mean, realistically, what we should have been doing is working with Turkey, that actually very courageously decided to stay while everyone else was leaving, but working with other European partners too to work out whether we could have continued to provide air support for the Afghan National Army and stop this catastrophe from occurring.
One of the defining messages of Joe Biden's presidential campaign was America is back. Do the events we've seen in Afghanistan prove that he was wrong? And do you think comparisons with Vietnam are appropriate?
I think that this is a very, very sad symbol of the beginning of Biden's presidency. When he says America is back, he seems to have a vision of a very, very isolationist America. I fear he's taken the wrong lesson from Donald Trump. I mean, effectively, this is a Trump continuity policy, and it's an idea that you can win votes by turning your back on the world. It's a cynical policy. It's directed at the midterms. It's directed at American voters in the Rust Belt. And it's true. Polls suggest that many Americans want to have nothing to do with Afghanistan. But a courageous politician would have taken on board the fact that Afghanistan was not something that most American voters were thinking about, that there have been very few American casualties there for the last 5 years, that the American presence in Afghanistan was very light, that it was doing an enormous amount of good, protecting the gains of the last 20 years, and would have avoided the temptation to try to make a political football out of something which wasn't high on American voters' minds. And would also have been responsible in explaining that the US presence was relatively light and cost-free and could be sustained, instead of which he's tried to suggest that he's freeing America from some $1 trillion forever war, saving American lives and bringing the boys home. Whereas, in fact, what he was doing was shutting in operation in which almost no Americans have been killed in the last few years, and which was largely dependent on air support to the Afghan National Army, and which was doing a lot of good. I mean, that's the other sadness, that if the early stages of this Afghan intervention were characterized by naive optimism, in other words, people believing that they could transform Afghanistan into some Switzerland in Central Asia, in the latter stage, it's been characterized by naive pessimism, by people who totally underestimate the progress that was made and totally underestimated how much we could achieve. I mean, the basic message from the beginning has been that we can do less than we pretend, but much more than we fear in Afghanistan. Right? And it's heartbreaking that we instead have lurched from supercharged engagement to total isolation, from surge to total withdrawal. It's exactly the wrong way to approach any problem. It doesn't matter whether it's Afghanistan or approaching another human being. What you need is a patient, textured, long-term engagement that's sustainable. And that generally means a light footprint, not we're going to try to solve the whole thing by flinging money at it for a short period.
To the extent that Joe Biden has had a defining foreign policy theme, it has been of strengthening America against China in a new era of great power competition. What does the Afghanistan debacle mean for that strategic conflict? Will China be emboldened by the US's retreat?
It's very difficult to know what China will make of this. I fear that for China, as for many other nations around the world, it will simply confirm a sense that has developed almost since the beginning of the Obama presidency, that the United States is now in full withdrawal from the world, that it no longer wishes to play an active role in trying to support global institutions, keep global stability and peace. I mean, the basic model that really has been around since the Second World War of the United States playing a role as a global policeman, and that America no longer is prepared to really stand by its allies or take the cost of the patient, textured engagement needed. And that is very, very unfortunate. I mean, it confirms an illusion amongst many authoritarian regimes, including China, that democracies are too short term to actually be able to do sustained foreign policy or defense, to think about relationships or obligations to people, that we simply lurch around and that we can't keep anything alive.
The events in Afghanistan have obviously been driven not just by the speed with which the Taliban have advanced, but also the speed with which the Afghan government fell. Do you think the West deluded itself for too long about the nature of the Afghan government and, for instance, the extent to which corruption and other structural problems had alienated many Afghan people?
The West deludes itself about governments all around the world. And that's partly for political reasons. I mean, I remember thinking about this as development secretary in relation to South Sudan. So you can imagine South Sudan, which is in a horrifying civil war. We kept producing documents talking about, how we were going to produce this amazingly progressive, non-corrupt state based on the rule of law and governance, which didn't begin to measure up with what I was seeing on the ground in South Sudan. But it's partly because civil servants, voters, politicians seem to find it almost unbearable to describe other countries accurately and honestly. The honest way to talk about Afghanistan, I felt, was to say, if we're lucky, in 20 years' time, Afghanistan will feel more like Pakistan and less like the Congo. But people didn't want to hear that because that's too uncomfortable. But the truth is that, yes, Afghanistan had huge problems, right? And the collapse of the government shows many of those problems. Enormous corruption, a very weak police force, no real credible central state, a very, very fractured country. But those problems exist in 30 or 40 fragile countries around the world, including wealthier places like Nigeria or Pakistan itself. There are insurgencies, for example, in India. There are insurgencies in Myanmar, which are much wealthier countries than Afghanistan. We should have factored that in, and we should have worked very patiently and realistically to develop the best bits of Afghanistan, which is in a sense what we were doing. I mean, millions of Afghans were being educated. Enormous new generation was going through university. Who knows what would have happened had we continued a patient, light, sustainable engagement in the country? Instead of which we were sort of perfectionist. Either we create a fully sustainable, fully functioning state, or we don't want to have anything to do with it. And that sort of reminds me, I mean, I've got a 4-year-old who has a tendency in that direction. Right? Either what he's doing works out perfectly and the whole thing gets smashed on the floor. And it's a very strange aspect of our civilization that we have the sort of attention of a toddler.
Obviously, a Taliban government is horrific for the people of Afghanistan, perhaps women and girls most of all. But it's also potentially horrific for the world. And how worried should the West be about Afghanistan once more becoming a central haven of terror?
Well, we should be very worried. I mean, Afghanistan is bang in the center of Central Asia. It will be a destabilizing influence on all its neighbors and a extreme Islamist government has just taken power by force. And we should be in no doubt of what the Taliban ideology is, and that it was perfectly natural for them to provide safe haven to Osama bin Laden. And they, yes, of course, primarily they're interested in Afghanistan, but they have a record in this. It's not implausible that they will again provide a place where international terrorist groups can base themselves. So this is a real setback for the world. I mean, 20 years after 9/11, instead of the dreams of the 1990s, when it felt that the world was getting steadily more stable, more democratic, more prosperous, that the number of places in the world where real instability and horror was happening was decreasing. We're now in a situation where in a matter of months, two of the great projects in the international community, Burma, Myanmar, and Afghanistan, have collapsed one after another.
You obviously know Afghanistan better than almost any other Western commentator. What have you heard from your contacts there, and how are the staff of your charity, the Turquoise Mountain Foundation?
Thank you, George. I don't want to dwell too much on staff because we have to think about their security too. But I think the general point for any Afghans that I'm talking to in Kabul at the moment is people are mostly staying at home. The city is shut. All the footage I'm seeing is of areas of the city I know very well now, with Taliban pickup trucks driving up and down, Taliban fighters wandering around inside the presidential palace, increasing stories about parliamentarians and others being abducted from their homes. More and more of my Afghan contacts are complaining that their goods and vehicles are now being looted and stolen from their houses. The civilian side of the airport has just been looted and attacked. And people are just hunkering down and hoping some degree of order is restored of any sort, and hoping that the Taliban is not going to start going after them. So one of the things that the international community could usefully do is to try to do all it can through intermediaries who have any influence over the Taliban to try to encourage them, at the very least, not to start taking brutal revenge around the city. Because as governments' services collapse, Afghanistan will be increasingly dependent on some very hardworking agencies and charities to deliver basic health, education, keep people alive in rural areas. And those organizations, including the United Nations and others, need to be able to operate safely.
There's been some horrific footage circulating online this morning of Afghans desperately clinging to military planes, and some of them horrifically falling to their deaths. A lot of people watching that will feel an immense sense of futility and despair. What should ordinary people watching this in the UK and elsewhere do in response?
Well, there's the humanitarian side, which is that please continue to support charities on the ground of any sort. And there are some, as you say, I'm connected with a charity, but there are many, many others, ranging from names that will be familiar to people like Save the Children, Oxfam, CARE, Mercy Corps, UNICEF, all of which have very good operations on the ground and where they have some very courageous staff trying to continue to operate. Continue to put pressure on governments around the world to be serious about taking some of the most vulnerable Afghans out of Afghanistan and not putting bureaucracy and paperwork in the way. I mean, and some of that is also, there will be a period now where it will be very difficult to get planes in and out of Afghanistan, but we can at least start processing paperwork to prepare to receive people, so that when flights start running again, we can begin to create a humanitarian air corridor to get people out and put pressure on governments to provide serious quantities of assistance to people who are now in desperate conditions on the ground.
Do you think this moment will come to be seen as a historic turning point and as the definitive end of the age of liberal interventionism?
Yes, I'm afraid it will. And it's a terrible, terrible end. I don't know how it feels for my ex-colleague Samantha Power, who we taught together at Harvard and is now the head of USAID and really was one of the great champions of intervention and saw the horrors of Rwanda and Bosnia and argued that we had a responsibility and we could make a difference. And indeed, we did make a difference. in Bosnia and even in Kosovo, really significant difference, saved lots of lives, improved societies, and in some ways, actually, Afghanistan for the last 5 years has been a good example of how that could be done with quite a light footprint. Right? We didn't need to have 100,000 troops on the ground to do that. This is a very pessimistic, despairing end. And it's going to take, I fear, a long time for the world to recover and find its feet again. And it's very, very sad for those of us who are involved in international affairs and care about other countries to see the United States, which was, has had many flaws, but in many ways also has been the cornerstone of some extraordinary progress and support over the last few decades, turning its back so decisively on a situation for which it had responsibility.
One of the lessons of this age is that there is no such thing as splendid isolation, that you can try and run from the consequences of foreign policy, but more often than not, they will come and find you. Do you think the West, one way or another, will ultimately be drawn back into Afghanistan?
I think it's very difficult for us to avoid being drawn back. The problem is that we tend to wait for a crisis and then lurch back in at a much more extravagant and expensive way when we could have kept light presences and, above all, relationships. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about Africa or you're talking about Afghanistan. What we needed to do was develop light footprints, good relationships, let the local government lead, provide support when necessary, but often indirect support, be generous with development and humanitarian aid, be flexible, have many more civilians on the ground who understand what's going on the ground, and think about this as a long-term project. And, I make the same case for much of sub-Saharan Africa, where 1 in 10 children born in the world will be born in Nigeria by 2050. 40% of the world will be African by the end of the century. That's where many issues of climate change, poverty, potentially instability are coming from. And yet we are withdrawing, as you say, trying to do the splendid isolation thing. When for relatively modest investment, countries like the United Kingdom, the United States could continue to play a positive and useful role supporting countries around the world for their benefit and ultimately for ours, because ultimately a more peaceful, stable world is a very good thing. And allowing countries to be abandoned and collapse into medieval horror is a very bad thing.
My final question, this foreign policy debacle obviously follows the COVID-19 pandemic and the huge failures of global coordination we've seen during that. Do you think these crises show that we are suffering from an age of systemic failure and where the need for global cooperation is growing, but its availability is falling?
Yes, and I think this is partly political. I mean, it's partly that different political parties around the world, particularly populists, but different political parties around the world, have seen the potential in isolation, like the idea of standing up for themselves individually. But that's largely a question of chest thumping and projecting yourself, and are very reluctant to do the patient, difficult work of cooperating with other people. Why don't they want to cooperate with other people? Well, because cooperating with other people by its nature is quite a humble activity in which you may not get all the credit, in which you share the responsibility and the blame, and it's complicated and it's difficult and it's slow work. But it's through doing that, of course, only through doing that we keep the international system going, whether it is dealing with COVID or dealing with Ebola, dealing ultimately with climate change and environmental challenges. So I'm hoping that a new generation of politicians will emerge who recommit in Britain and elsewhere to that international system. Now, of course, there are countries who do that. Germany has increasingly tried to lean in that direction in different ways, New Zealand, Scandinavian countries, Canada. But it's sad to see major players like the United Kingdom shying away from that when we could play a really influential role in trying to rebuild that kind of global system.
Thank you very much for joining us, Rory.
Thank you very much indeed, George.